have such a crowd here today for Dr. Laurie Johnson's talk. We're very pleased to have her with us today. Before we get to that, though, I just wanted to cover a couple of administrative things for the students in the NRES capstone course. You will have an exam on Thursday, and this talk will be included. We are going to post a little study guide for you after this, well, later this afternoon. Okay, so you will have that to kind of help guide your study. But let's go ahead and get to Dr. Laurie Johnson. Dr. Johnson is a professor of political science and the director of the primary tax certificate program here at Kansas State. She's authored many books and so is a prolific writer, and she also teaches the environmental political thought course that counts as part of the NRES program. So if you all are interested in that, then you should definitely look at that in terms of your course schedules. But I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, that clock appears to be accurate, so that's good. I'll keep an eye on that. As I understand it, I'm supposed to talk for about 30 minutes and then take questions, so that's what I will try to do. The first thing I always say in a talk like this is that I am not a scientist. I am a political scientist, which means that my business is not to try to teach the scientific information. That's something that you get from your courses. But one thing that's important for people to know, and they often don't know as well as they probably should if they go into a field such as many of you are in, is the political dimensions of these issues and the challenges that come from the political and ideological side. And actually, science can tell you exactly, the facts, but as you all know, if you really think about it, if the political rhetoric doesn't match up with that, or if people are persuaded by ideological and political arguments to the contrary, they don't listen to those facts. The facts are not the most important thing. Politics, writ large, kind of makes the world go round, not science. And so that's why it's important for people who are engaged in science and technology and engineering related fields to know a little bit about the lay of the landscape, so that when they communicate with people and when they deal with people coming at them with arguments, they have some idea where they're coming from. So my goal today is to kind of give you a little bit of the lay of the land, ideologically speaking. So I think the original talk was supposed to be entitled Climate Change and Ideologies, and apparently I changed that a little bit, but that's actually more accurate. I'm not sure what happened there. Many of you probably have heard of the climate strike phenomenon, right? Okay, and that's kind of an ongoing thing, and it's happening around the world. It particularly seems to have emerged first in Europe with the Extinction Rebellion and other organizations there. But it's also come to the United States, and we had one recent event here at K-State that attempted to do a little bit of that. These are some organizations associated with the climate strike idea, which is just the idea that it's originated with the idea that students would come out of the classroom and instead demonstrate, protest, and show their support and their demand for politicians to make changes in their legislation and their regulations and so on. So these are just some of the movements involved in the climate strike idea. I got into this aspect of it because I have friends that are have been involved in doing this activity, also because I learned about Greta Thunberg and kind of learned quite a bit about her and her impact. And if you don't know who Greta is, she's the 16-year-old girl who's from Sweden, who's somehow managed to make this rather huge impact in popular culture for the idea of attention to climate change and climate strike as a method. As a matter of fact, that Fridays for Future is Thunberg's organization, basically. So when thinking about that approach, the climate strike approach, the demonstration approach, I think about, well, what is the audience? What is the intended audience for that? And believe me, I'm going somewhere else with this. But the intended audience for that, if you listen to Greta Thunberg talk, is institutions primarily. So for instance, she went to the United Nations, and she and other activists got a hearing there, and she made the appeal that people needed to, these people needed to listen to the science, and they needed to, support international agreements like a Paris Climate Accord, and get everybody on board to stop as much as possible the emissions that add to global warming. World leaders and legislatures, sometimes businesses. In Kansas City, the climate strike people on, I think it was September 20th, protested in front of the Kansas City Star because they were basically saying that the media did not report on these issues as though it was the crisis that they think it is, okay? So they were angry at them, and they were saying, you need to report on this more. Sometimes the message is also aimed at citizens, as in individual people, and how they might change. So the demands are for things specifically like reducing carbon emissions before the tipping point. Now, as you all know, there's a big debate about whether we've already hit the tipping point, right? But when you listen to Thunberg talk, she kind of hedges and says, well, we may have, but we may not have, or there's still time. And you hear that a lot because, after all, if there isn't still time, then we probably can just stop talking about it in a way. So there's that sense of urgency. At the international level, you've got those types of demands. And at the individual level, it's to change your individual behavior. In Thunberg's rhetoric, it's mainly the older people who need to change their behavior. But if you think about it, we all probably, objectively speaking, ought to change our behavior from that perspective. Okay, so these are all pretty normal modes of political activity, okay? There's nothing unusual about protesting and making demands and petitioning governments. That's been around for a long, long time. It's a very sort of liberal, democratic way to proceed. It assumes certain things, such as that governments are still a source of potential source of change because they represent us. Okay, so the assumption there is that governments represent us as citizens and as voters, and we can have an impact and make our government do something, right? Another assumption is that international agreements can be reliable means of change, okay? But international agreements are problematic. We'll talk a little bit more about that, okay? But there's no enforcement mechanism. And another assumption is that personal individual change can add up to collective change. Okay, those are underlying assumptions of this approach. Okay? Now, what's interesting to me is that these are normal modes of, as I said, normal and very acceptable modes of political discourse, right? And the assumptions behind them, see, I'm a political theorist, so this is the way I think, but the assumptions behind them are largely what we call classical liberal, okay? Does anybody recognize this guy? Adam Smith, I'll just let you know. Adam Smith, and let's see, John Locke, okay? Two of the fathers of classical liberalism. He's kind of the guy that's credited with, coming up with the idea of the division of labor, efficiency, capitalism, and John Locke, representative government, individual rights, social contract, all of that, okay? That is the ideology that really undergirds the climate strike approach and the whole approach of petitioning government and institutions for redress of grievances, basically. So, to kind of elaborate, in classical liberalism, the individual is still the primary subject, okay, the actor, who represents the wills, the state represents the wills of individual citizens, the voters, the constituents, okay? And so petitioning government makes sense in that case. You want to force your government to change. Equality and rights are important, so in the climate issues you tend to get talk about reasserting individual rights against the corporate power. So for instance, not using eminent domain laws, the power of government to take people's property away from them, to run a pipeline through their land or whatever it may be. That's a classical liberal defense of property rights. The idea in classical liberalism is that capitalism generally works. People involved in climate strike protests tend to say we need government to regulate better and to do a better job of sort of balancing the interests of business with all of our interests as people to a healthy environment. But it doesn't say, they tend to not say, although it depends on the person, that capitalism is something we need to throw away. Economic growth is desirable, it just needs to be done wisely, and technological progress is ongoing and generally good, and it can actually help solve our problems, but we need to control technology so that it works for us rather than working against us. And a lot of times they'll make the argument that our economy is not feasible in long term unless we make these changes. So part of the objective of this approach is to preserve the system the way it is. The fear is that it's going to go away. So we need to adjust and do what it takes to keep the good things that we have going, okay? That might be a little different way to think about this than you're used to, okay? But here's some examples of liberal, classically liberal green expressions. Okay? Changing laws and regulations. The Green New Deal, a big part of that, a big part of the draw is the provision of jobs. We're losing jobs due to automation. We're losing jobs due to corporations going overseas and so on and so forth. A lot of that economic activity has caused the pollution that leads to the climate problems. But we can change all that by a new deal, a new deal that provides jobs, that sort of kickstarts a green economy that will then allow us to continue with our way of life, with people more satisfied, because the people who have been displaced will now have work to do in this new economy. Property rights, we've already talked about that. Technological and economic accelerationisms, that's a word you probably don't know, but it just means in this way of thinking, some people say we need to speed up certain technological developments. And one of the proposals that's characteristic of this approach is seeding the stratosphere with particles that will more or less stop some of the sun's rays and reflect them back up to cool the globe. Okay, those are all in the works. Okay. So what I really want to get at is what, if anything, lies beyond liberalism. These are the things that we need to start keeping on our radar screen, because the so-called Overton window is growing wider, as you've probably noticed. We are talking about political ideas and ideologies that previously were sort of off the table, especially in the United States, okay? So the Overton window idea is that in any given time, there's topics that are acceptable and that you can actually have a reasonable discourse about. And then there's things that the society just won't talk about. Like in the United States, communism would be an example of that, right? Or fascism would be an example of that, because we've kind of put those off the table because of historical experiences that we've had, okay? But at this point in time, I can tell you with absolute certainty, the window is expanding, okay? And the types of ideas that are acceptable are growing. And so liberalism lies within this definitely acceptable framework, but we're starting to talk about ideologies that do not go along with liberalism. Yeah?
It's very interesting to me, and it's also novel to me. And I'm a foreigner, so could you give an example of something that was outside of the window a while ago and that is now inside, so I can follow along?
Yeah, democratic socialism would be a sort of mild example of what's now inside the window, because we now have, say, Bernie Sanders and people like that who are being taken seriously. To a certain extent, the alt-right ideology is also now coming within inside that Overton window. People are starting to talk there's enough people that are interested in that ideology to say it is now more of a product of mainstream discourse, more and more. Okay, so that's kind of what I'm talking about. So if we want to kind of get into the mindset of where people are coming from when they start to question the mainstream, what used to be inside the Overton window, we can do it by looking at some of the criticisms of the liberal approach, okay? This is one avenue of criticism. Maybe some of you have heard of the term greenwashing or green capitalism. These are critical terms, okay? Greenwashing is the idea that capitalism can kind of continue apace as long as it kind of shows that it's responsible somehow. Like it puts the green label on it, the organic label on it. It says, you know, we're doing our part to cut down on our plastic pollution. We're packaging our products differently. We're trying to like offset our emissions by this or that device. And the products are marketed to you as a consumer as though if you buy them, you are contributing to the solution to pollution and global warming. But critics of this whole thing say basically what's going on here is that the corporations have found a new marketing technique, right? And this is a way that they can continue to grow. Sometimes those practices are questionable and are just merely a matter of a label, but even if they're not, growth is still the key aim of making these types of changes. And some of them, including ethanol production and corn and bamboo-based paper products, arguably actually make the planet worse off and not better. But we go down this path. All right, so there are people who say, no, this is an illusion. This is stuff that people have been sold as a solution. Also, notice that these things tend to put all the responsibility back on you as the consumer, as though by buying certain products, you vote, and therefore you change the economy, and therefore you have an impact, okay? But without investigating that further, you would have no idea if you've actually managed to have that impact. And it puts all the responsibility on individuals, which is very nice, isn't less responsibility on government and corporations. Okay, so from the critics' perspective, what's wrong with that? Well, they argue that these modes, green capitalism, does not change the underlying values of economic growth via increased consumption and faith in technological progress. So there's a growing criticism and questioning of technological progress, okay? And there are those who do not believe that we can change these things without changing our values and our life, our way of life more drastically, okay? More drastically, okay? And I'm not up here advocating this. I am in a position of still learning, and I generally tend to not like the idea of revolutionary change, but it just so happens that there are a growing number of people talking about revolutionary change. And it's not Bernie Sanders, okay? Democratic socialists are still pretty mainstream when it comes right down to it. They tend to argue for stronger versions of these liberal solutions, more regulation, more transfers, more job creation programs and things like that to change our infrastructure. But still, you know, there's faith in economic growth and technological progress, okay? So we're not talking about democratic socialists. Okay? We're beginning to see ideologies that truly question and reject liberal values. The mildest option is what we call classical conservatism. It's different from the type of conservatism that you have experienced. It's not Reagan, Thatcher conservatism. It's not pro-capitalist. This is Edmund Burke, and he's sort of considered the father of classical liberalism. And some of the assumptions of this way of thinking are that society and not the individual is primary, okay? That community is of the primary importance, and you have to be careful to keep that social fabric from unraveling. that social goods come before individual rights, and a big problem emerges when individuals start saying, this is my right to this, absolute right, without consideration for the impact that it has on other people. And so those in our modern world who embrace this general approach will question the idea, for instance, that corporations are equal to individual citizens and their right to free speech, which was established by our Supreme Court in 2010 in a court case called Citizens United. Right? Because they have a lot more power. They question competition and capitalism as disruptive to the social fabric. Too much growth, too much change, too much displacement, the exploitation of the environment causes disruption in human communities, makes it harder for us to live meaningful lives. And they question technological progress generally for that reason. We need to think about what we value first and then use technology to achieve that rather than allowing technology to drive us, okay? So these are pretty mild but still not liberal ideas. An outfit that kind of represents this approach is Front Porch Republic, so you can Google that and look at all the essays that they have there. They're very much pushing the idea of a sort of regionalism and localism and return to tighter knit, less attached to the globalized economy communities. If you know Wendell Berry at all, you know Wendell Berry as a thinker is associated with this approach. His book Unsettling of America would be a good place to start. They call for a devolution of power, so they're not necessarily saying let's get rid of the whole system, but they're saying within, like, say, the American system, localities, towns, cities, regions should have quite a bit more power and quite a bit more say about how they live their lives, right? They would not like the idea that California, for instance, couldn't have its own emission standards or anything else separate from what the federal government has to say about it, okay? So take a look at that if you're interested in that, Front Porch Republic. But there's a lot of different people advocating different versions of localism and semi-secession from the larger global economy. Then we get a little bit stronger in the proposals of anarchists. Now, you might think, oh my God, anarchists, those are people who just want anarchy, as in sons of anarchy, right? Or, you know, total, like, violence and whatever. Anarchists actually are kind of the opposite of that. They believe that the problem, the cause of a lot of violence and disruption is government, and that people can, if left to their own devices, cooperate much more easily. So these people are people who want a more strong secession from the larger system, and they want to either live within or even more ideally apart from those larger political and economic systems. So Chyron, Mexico is an example of this. This is a town that just decided it had had enough of the drug cartels and the corrupt government, and they basically took matters into their own hands, and they policed their own area. They keep the drug people out. They largely ignore the government and govern their town the way they want to. And the idea there is the more independent they are, the more free they are, again, of the global economy and the national system, the more they can do things their way that's sustainable for them, okay? They can provide for themselves, all right, in a way that works for them and for their environment. Exarchaea in Greece is another example of an anarchist community that's been around for a long time. And in general, Greece has got lots of anarchists because their economy and their government fell apart, and they pretty much had to fall back on their own devices. Milder versions of this would be eco-villages, and expressions of this general secession mentality include gift economy. This is where people agree to form a community where they exchange goods and services without money. Again, the idea being independence, self-reliance, sustainability within their particular area. Murray Bookchin is a good thinker in the social ecology movement for this type of anarchist approach. Then we have communism. Communism is actually being openly discussed by some thinkers, and of course not the totalitarian kind that we've already tried in this world, but there are people who, despite that legacy, are beginning to talk about perhaps it's time to think again about whether we need to change the system very drastically, right? And that the problem is competition, which gets in the way of people being able to plan so that the technology is used for the benefit and the good of society and the environment, and not just for the profits of corporations. Competition, in their view, is kind of irrational, and it adds a dimension that doesn't allow people to actually do what it takes to cooperate and act rationally, okay? So communists will, like Slavoj Žižek, will argue for more or less a revolution. They think it would take a revolution to do this, and there's more open talk of the need for a revolution in these circles. They want a complete common ownership of the means of production, right? So that would take a revolution in order to do that. And they want, the communist approach is planning and cooperation. An example of this is Cuban agriculture. Actually, if we, I'm trying to think of examples that deal specifically with the environment and with food production and things like that. And the Cubans were cut off due to embargoes and from a lot of world commerce because of their communist government during the Cold War. So they didn't have access to all the technological stuff provided by the West. And then eventually when they were cut off from the Soviet Union, it got even worse, and they really had to fend for themselves. And in the wake of that, they developed some pretty amazing farming techniques that involve local, diversified, and pretty darn sustainable farming. So you might want to take a look at that example. But at this point, you're getting into some pretty scary stuff, because if the more that people openly talk about ideas like this, the more you know that society has kind of reached a point where that Overton window is widening pretty large, and usually when that happens, something happens. Something happens, and arguably something is happening. I mean, from my perspective, populist movements are springing up all over the world. It's a global phenomenon. It seems to be a reaction to the damages and the harms caused by globalization. And it needs to be addressed, and it probably behooves us to think about these things and not just allow Zizek and Guillaume Fay to talk about them. Scientists need to start talking about them and understanding them. So the last one that I want to talk about is the alt-right and new right. If you know about them, you may know them, like I said, through the Charlottesville Torch March, or, Richard Spencer, Breitbart, whatever. But in Europe, the new right is a more serious endeavor, and it's been going on for decades, and it's gained a lot of steam, and in some countries it has won elections, is a very credible ideological force. And it just so happens that they pay quite a bit of attention to environmental issues. One of their appeals and one of the ways that they draw adherents is that they really speak to the environmental threats and how capitalism, how the current mode of governance and the way that people live has not addressed that. This guy, Guillaume Fay, in this book, Archaeofuturism, basically says it's too late. We've gone over the tipping point. It's going to happen. We're going to have an environmental catastrophe. And what's going to happen in the wake of that is that we're going to have to go back to regional, local, and in his case, ethnically and culturally homogenous groups, because those are the types of groups, in his view, that can be strong enough to cooperate with each other to survive. Okay. He predicts that there will be pockets of high-tech peoples that will still exist, but the vast majority of the human race is going to revert back to archaic tribal conditions, and that's okay because that's what it's going to take to save the planet. Basically, the planet is fighting back, and it's going to force these changes on us. Now, the New Right generally argues, like in the French New Right platform, which maybe I can share this somehow with you guys so that you can look at this. They assume that at this point in time, because of the catastrophes and the history that we've experienced in the past, that people can live in these types of conditions with some people in advanced, many more people living in archaic tribal type communities, and there will not be exploitation and there will not be racial persecution and all of those things, all right? I wish I had time to explain to you more, but if you want to know more about that, ask me some questions about that and I can. But the general notion is we've come a long way and now we can achieve the best of these types of communities, homogenous racially, culturally, maybe in religious terms, without the side effect of pernicious racism and persecution. Okay? Obviously, it may come as a surprise to you that the New Right gives very serious thought to environmental issues, but that is the case. And even Richard Spencer, who's not known for that, does, if you know who he is, but National Policy Institute. He's one of the people behind the Charlottesville March. Okay, and so I'll just conclude with this, that these ideologies are coming into play more and more. They're more extreme. They're more challenging to the system the way it's been. They aren't necessarily bad, or at least not all of them. They all have some ideas that might be worth learning from, okay? At the very least, you need to know that they exist, and that if things do get worse, those more extreme ideologies are the ones that gain traction, and that's just a fact. It's a political fact of life. So they tend to propagate on the internet, where especially young people, and particularly young males, tend to get a lot of their information, especially from YouTube, from message boards and whatnot, okay? And so one of the weirder phenomenon that I've noticed is that people say over 35 or 40 maybe don't even know this is happening, right? There's like at least 2 different worlds and probably like 20 different worlds, and they're not even aware. But these conversations are serious, they're ongoing, they involve pretty smart people, they also involve kind of dumb people, but they involve a lot of smart people as well, okay? Slavoj Žižek and Guillaume Fay are very smart people, right? And so we really need to learn about them, especially because we may be confronting them more and more in the future. All right, so I will stop and just ask you if you have any questions or you want more information about any of these different trends. Sorry, I'm probably walking around a lot. Questions? Yeah.
So I don't know if there's like an assumption that people are kind of rigid in their ideology, but it seems to me, or at least that I suspect, that people kind of morph their ideologies, or that they don't think about them seriously enough and apply them to every aspect of their life, to the point that really it's the ends that kind of dictate what their means are, their means being their political ideology or how they want to approach some sort of situation. Would you agree that that's kind of so? Or?
I think it's true until you get to a point where there's a crisis. When crises happen, then people tend to become more religious and zealous in their ideologies. They tend, because insecurity makes you want to latch on to a particular solution harder. And so that's when radical things happen more likely. But at this point, I mean, I myself, I read widely in all of these areas, and I have to tell you, it may be kind of scary, but you can learn something and agree with almost any of them in some respects. And that's worthwhile. That's worth doing because it expands your mind. But there are times when, you know, during economic crises, or if an environmental crisis really gets bad enough that, you know, survival starts to be an issue, where it's easier to radicalize people, which just means that they're more likely to become rigid, to use your language. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you go back to the new rank slide?
Sure.
You were talking about having to be able to put these groups kind of back culturally together, and that some groups would have technology and others wouldn't, but yet we would not take advantage of them. How do they present that somebody would actually find that plausible?
Okay, well, the way that he does it is to say that because of the catastrophe that he believes is going to happen, that's going to basically disintegrate a lot of these larger governments and societies, that we will have to learn that we cannot, that there are certain things that we cannot do with technology. In other words, that will teach us the lesson that we have to control our technology and make it appropriate to our values and our actual needs instead of technology leading us. The way he sees it is technology has been out of control. Basically, if we can make something, we will. But at this point in time, surely we will learn the lesson that that's a bad approach, and we, in these areas where high technology is still available, there will be an understanding that it needs to be used for prudent purposes and not for endless economic growth or, you know, what he calls Baroque development of technology just for the sake of technology. That to me personally is very is almost utopian, because I think that it's so deeply ingrained. Human beings, whenever they've developed any technology, even if it's just a spear, you know, have excessively used it and figured out how to abuse it. And so I wonder if even in a catastrophe, people could learn that lesson. But that's his answer, is that. In a way, it's sort of weirdly Enlightenment thinking within an anti-Enlightenment way of thinking, which is we can learn from our mistakes. But, you know, as you probably know, this historian, right? When have people ever learned from their mistakes? Even in catastrophic situations, right? Like, people have been through major catastrophes of their own making before, and have gone on to repeat the same thing again. So I'm not convinced, but yeah.
So I'm studying engineering, like biosystems engineering, so how would someone like an engineer or scientist be able to convey like their information or what they think regarding, you know, like climate change, green technology, et cetera, to these different groups effectively in order to actually help make change?
Well, I think one thing that we all need to do, but maybe particularly people involved in science and technology, is to start out acknowledging the concerns that the people have who tend to gravitate to more extreme solutions. That they maybe are threatened because they don't have a secure job in their future, right? Because automation is taking away their jobs. Or they're trapped into a situation where they have to accept the environmental degradation because that's the only way they can make a living, is because those are the jobs that are available to them. And so if you're, you know, reliant on your livelihood to the fracking industry or whatever it may be, then how can you be asked also to to kind of agree with a way of thinking that's going to sever you from your job. This is partly why I think the Green New Deal, even though maybe it's not going to end up being enough, is kind of a cool idea because it's linking jobs with some of these changes. Because the people who are most opposed or who tend to be the most skeptical are people who feel very insecure for one reason or another. And they will therefore cling very strongly to arguments for not regulating industry because those industries are their only hope. You know, like the classic case of the coal miner who's just hoping that his job doesn't go away because he's got nothing else to do. So we would have to, you know, make a concerted effort to assure people that, no, we're not going to just leave you unemployed because we don't care about you. We care about you. So even though you're a scientist, I think when you're trying to have that conversation, you have to recognize there's a real human dimension here, and that these people are caught in a bind, you know, where they're likely to suffer, and in their past, they have. You know, when economic changes happen, nobody necessarily takes care of them, right? They're told to retool at their own expense. And so the Green New Deal, at least as I understand it, some of the ideas involve helping people to retool and getting them into jobs that are more, that support new types of energy and things like that. It would require a lot of government action to do that. So starting that conversation with, you know, I actually understand, because what we tend to do if we're on this side of the environmental equation is to say, I don't even understand you. You're kind of like not my type of person, and I don't understand the way you think. And furthermore, you might be bad, and you're definitely ignorant. And I don't think that's a non-starter. So you lose people immediately when you come at them with that perspective. So I would say empathy. You know, there's a book that I read last year by Arlie Hochschild called Strangers in Their Own Land, which I would recommend to anybody in this situation. She went down to Louisiana and spent 5 years there talking to people impacted by the pollution caused by the oil and gas industry, who'd lost their home value, their hunting and fishing that their families had lived on for years, and now weren't even secure in their jobs, but they were still very hopeful that these industries would stay, and they were unwilling to ask for any sort of changes because they felt vulnerable enough, right? And when you're that vulnerable, when you feel you're that precarious, you're going to probably align yourself with the ideologies that make that position respectable. So, empathy, yeah.
So I have a question about this slide that's up about the alt-right, new right, and how those ideologies look in terms of environmentalism. In the United States in particular, it seems like the current presidential administration was supported by and also galvanized the alt-right, but this presidential administration is very anti-environmentalism and very much in denial of what is considered to be scientific fact about environmental change. So how does that fit into your presentation of this?
It doesn't. The American alt-right or the American version of this is different in that respect and doesn't focus as much on environmental issues as the European. Although there is a connection in the sort of schizophrenic approach of the Trump administration regarding more or less, you know, the previous conservative position in the United States was that the freer the trade, the better, okay? And so, you know, knock down those trade barriers, knock down those, you know, make sure that the trade agreements that we have are as free and as open trade as possible. But what we see in President Trump's administration is a back and forth. Okay, naturally speaking, he seems to lean against free trade, as you've seen. He's suspicious of international trade agreements. He thinks that you know, we ought to like compete with these other countries that he sees almost like independent companies that we need to like stop from taking advantage of us, et cetera. And you know, raising tariffs and things like that is all a part of that. So he kind of resonates to a certain extent with the anti-globalization, which is something new for Republicans. And it's just a departure. It doesn't match up with the previous Republican ideology very well at all. But it does seem to be something that has been embraced by a lot of Republicans. So there's a little echo of that there, but on the environmental issue, no. It's like, no, he's not going there, and most Americans of the alt-right variety don't really care as much about that issue. Although, like I said, if you read Richard Spencer and listen to what he talks about and some of the things that they put out at the National Policy Institute, there is some coverage of that, but it doesn't necessarily get traction with people in power. Yeah.
A lot of what you talked about is obviously more applicable in representative governments, but a lot of climate change is happening, a lot of pollution is happening, like in China, for instance, a non-representative government.
Mm-hmm.
And how does political change come about, like climate change politics show up in those sorts of countries?
You know what? I mean, that's an excellent question. It doesn't, in our own situation where we have a democracy, where the people's power is arguably more real, we're not doing that great of a job either. I mean, one thing that has happened in China is they got to the point where their air was so polluted that people couldn't go out without gas masks. And the government decided that it was going to do something about it, and it has. It's not perfect, but they've made more drastic and quick changes than we have in this regard. So, and why? Because out of their own kind of self-interest they have. How you influence a country like China, I don't know, right? It's huge. It's a rival for the United States for power at this point on the global scale, and international agreements. I think I promised to say something about this. One thing I learned in like grad school, which I still believe today, is it's true. Like, international agreements cannot be enforced, right? There is no enforcement mechanism. They are as good as the countries involved and the political will within those countries. So you can't tell China, whether it's involved in those agreements or not, what to do. It really boils down to, does the country see it in its self-interest to make these changes? And arguably, China, in a way, might be, if it sees it's in its interest, it might arguably be in a little bit better position to implement them, because it doesn't have to ask the people, and it doesn't have, although its economy is changing, it's the corporate power isn't standing in the way as much. I don't know if did that answer sort of your question? Okay, yeah.
So the Greta Thunberg phenomenon is quite the phenomenon. I wonder if it doesn't risk becoming its own straw man, in effect. People have bandied about the term pedophrasty, and how Greta Thunberg may just become the straw man for what about the children, and rather than pushing the point of, we needed to make some changes, it'll become a distraction insofar as it's not actually addressing the legitimate concerns that are out there among the scientific community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, there's a whole growing body of critique about Thunberg herself and that general approach. There is, I mean, it's not like it hasn't been already tried, basically. The only novelty with Thunberg is that she's so young, and so there tends to be this sort of like, oh, look, it's a young, innocent person sort of pulling our heartstrings and making us think about this more. And I mean, kudos to her for having the courage to do it. But ultimately, she's saying things that have been said over and over and over again. And in effect, I mean, one of the things that this Zizek points out, the communist, is that lots of times what happens with this type of thing is people, like, let's say they like Greta Thunberg and they get into her quest emotionally and they follow her, and they maybe support Fridays for Future, and maybe they, like do more along those lines. Then they feel like they've done their part simply by sort of resonating and identifying with this figure, and maybe taking part mildly in a couple of actions. But in a way that actually, I mean, from his perspective, that siphons off energy that could be used to actually get something done. So while I think, you know, it's always good for young people to try to speak their mind, what we find time and time again is they speak their mind and then nothing happens. Another instance of this would be the whole gun control issue where, you know, young people will come out very vociferously after one of these mass shootings with protests, with talks, with debates even, and then, as we know, very little changes. Everybody goes home and I guess feels better, but nothing generally happens. So, I mean, that's hard to hear, but if you're interested in this type of thing, it really behooves you to think about how those types of activities that you're persuaded to do may actually just sort of siphon off your energy, both individually and socially, from actually getting anything meaningfully done. And that is one thing that you can learn from listening to these more extreme critiques. That's a point, you know, it's actually a pretty decent point. Okay, I got probably, does it end at this point? Or how much time do I have?
We could, if there's another question.
Like, okay, one more question. Yeah.
Do you have anything to say about partisanship and our inability to separate political ideology as a whole from our ability to solve individual problems like climate change? People who hold a position on climate change often hold similar views in other ways that's kind of splitting the government into the right or left or whatever, and how we can overcome individual problems within these different frameworks.
Yeah, I think obviously it's the sort of polarization that's happened and the sort of, you know, tribalization of politics in our country, where you're either on this team or you're on that team and you believe everything that team tells you is a problem. It's a part of the problem. And one of the benefits of looking beyond that rhetoric, which is so standard and so predictable, is that you realize that, say, ecological issues are not just the province of the left or right. They are more universal and they can be treated by various types of people in different ways. And, you know, I would think breaking free from that and realizing that your own party, whatever it is, may not fully represent your interests or be absolutely right. It could only be beneficial for our political participation, because it would make for smarter voters. When people just sort of assume that my group is the angels and your group are the devils, right? Then you know, you're locked in and you become just a sort of resource or an asset for that particular political party. And then their whole like strategy is just to get you to get out and vote, full Democrat or full Republican or whatever it may be. Part of our problem is those are our only two options because of the political system that we have, and it tends to produce this. But it's gotten really bad lately, and we don't have time, I guess, to talk about this, but part of the reason it has is because of the media, the way the media is done now, and how easy it is for us to avoid hearing other ideas, right? So even though they're out there, I mean, you know, there are lots of people who say, look, why is everybody so dumb these days? Nobody talks about the issues. Nobody like makes a coherent argument. Oh no, that's not true at all. There's more political and economic and moral discourse going on in our world than ever before by so many smart people. But a lot of people never get there, never take advantage of it, never hear it, because they're convinced already that their one way is the only way. So anyway, well, I'm out of time, so nice talking to you.